All right, good afternoon, class. We'll get started. As I promised in class today, I'm going to make some additional comments before we pivot from the Ottomans in Chapter 11 and move on to other important developments that include China and Europe, as your textbook continues to sort of push along and nudge along slowly each of these cultural spheres as they continue to develop throughout the early modern period. So we're reminded here of today's objective. I began talking about some of the interesting characteristics of Ottoman rule, some of the secrets of their success, if you will. And we know that the illustrious run that they had, both before and a little bit after the very impressive rule of the Suleiman regime, we know that there were a lot of successes that the Ottomans could claim, and so we took a little time to try to get at some of the principles and institutions behind those successes. On this map, we looked at this in class, but I just want to remind you, if you look at the easternmost edge of this map, which is essentially the map of the Ottoman realm during its height, I just want to point out that on the eastern side there is the edge of control of a sort of counterweight or counterpoint to Ottoman rule, the Safavid Empire, which your textbook mentions. We aren't going to be talking about them too much directly in class, but they will emerge a little bit later in my comments in the screencast. And so I just want you to understand that to the east of the Ottomans was a rival Muslim empire, the Safavid Empire, which was culturally distinct from the Ottomans in the sense that the Safavid were Shiite Muslims, and you're probably already gaining an appreciation in this course that that divide or that schism fracture within the Islamic world was a very real and significant one. And then of course on the west, the western edge, you'll see Western Europe, which, as we know in our looking at that cultural sphere and its experience leading up to the Black Death in the mid-1300s, mid-14th century, we know that this is going to increasingly be a world region or cultural sphere of significance and influence. So we left off today talking about how the Ottoman claim to greatness, a lot of the economic strength, and of course a lot of these wonderful governmental institutions and the power and foreign policy of a famous Ottoman sultan like Suleiman is going to be at least indirectly credited to the strength of the economy, the ability of this empire to control resources and profit off of the world around it. And for the Ottomans, well into the 1600s, for the Ottomans that meant controlling this really strategic and geopolitically important land of the world of that time. And as I mentioned, the nature of trade, particularly with the Mediterranean, at this point there was no alternative. You couldn't go around Africa. You had to go through the Ottoman realm, and the Ottomans knew this, and the Ottomans profited handsomely off of the taxation and trade that was taking place in the world all around them. And so this set up a really interesting, I like to think of this as a different business plan, because the business plan that we're going to start to see happen during the height of Ottoman rule is that Western Europeans, starting with the Portuguese, but continuing with the Spanish, British, French, they're increasingly going to find ways to go around the Ottoman land trade. And it's this going around, this end run of established trade patterns at this time that's going to really be the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire. And not to mention, as we'll talk next week when we start looking at the Atlantic trade developments and connections on the Atlantic side of the world, we're going to realize that this is mean, in some ways it makes sense that it's the countries, particularly from the farthest west of Europe, that start this kind of searching and exploring and looking for alternatives, because they were the ones that were paying the most for global trade items at this time. Also point out that the Ottomans had a close encounter. We know in 1453 they experienced a tremendous triumph when they toppled and took from Byzantine control after about 1,000 years of trying. They toppled Constantinople and transformed it into the great Islamic city of Istanbul. But they had also, as they were eyeing up and looking at Constantinople, early sultans of the Ottoman Empire had bypassed, and I don't know if this is going to show, but here's our Constantinople, right? And here, that may or may not show, it probably doesn't. But right in the middle of this map, even before Constantinople had fallen, sultans of the Ottoman Empire had bypassed it and gone to the west into Europe. And they continued to do this, and both in 1529 and 1683, Ottoman emperors, first Suleiman, and then later successors in the line on down from Suleiman, tried but failed to make greater inroads into Europe. We aren't done with Europe. But what I want to point out is that the Ottomans were in the middle of Europe on the west, and then the Safavid, their rival Safavid Empire on the east. And their rivals will find a way to try to check the ambitions of the Ottoman Empire. I have Habsburgs here. That just refers to the Eastern European powers, the Habsburg family, the Habsburg dynasty. They are going to work with the Safavids to try to bring about the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And this sort of two-fronted or two-sided approach really makes it difficult for the Ottomans because they're divided. They have to worry about both their east and west flank. And that's an important development that helps explain how the Ottomans were kept in check. Secrets to the Ottoman strength, their military, so on and so forth. First off, we have this place referred to as the Sublime Porte. And this is actually a French term, but it was applied to the Ottoman Empire from an early period of Ottoman might and Ottoman greatness. But it refers to essentially the seat of power. So in Istanbul, there was a special district, a diplomatic district, where European, Safavid, Indian, Chinese, what have you, any foreign emissary, an official diplomat who was representing a civilized power at that time would meet and try to conduct business with the Ottoman Empire at the Sublime Porte. Now, the Sublime Porte kind of actually refers to the gate, and you can see it here, the gate into this diplomatic community in Istanbul. But it has since come to mean the entire state apparatus. So when you refer to the Sublime Porte in, say, 1650, you would have been referring to the Diwan, the Grand Vizier, the Sultan, all of the court officials, and essentially the machinery of the Ottoman state would have been accompanied in that phrase. And it became a very important factor in global discussion and determining the global order. Now, the military of the Ottomans is interesting, and it also is going to undergo change even throughout the period of greatness. In the early going, it would have referred to the cavalry and infantry, and there was a special group of people known as the Ghazis, who were essentially mounted warriors, many of them sort of from the steppe, Turkic warriors, nomadic horsemen from the east. And over time, what would happen is the Ottomans would arrange with these groups of nomads, send them into battle. They would generally succeed oftentimes in the West as they tried to head and penetrate deeper into Europe. And the Ottoman Empire would credit or compensate them by granting them lands from which they had successfully taken. But over time, this group of people, these Ghazis, are going to become skilled bureaucrats because they are not only conquering new lands, but they are settling them, establishing them. In some ways, it's kind of like the Darugachi, like, okay, you want it, we wish to hold it, you can be responsible for properly running this newly acquired territory within the Ottoman Empire. This, over time, became something of a threat because these Ghazis were rather talented and skilled managers. And so, over time, by the time we get to Suleiman, we're going to see that within the Ottoman Empire, there's going to be a shift from this kind of mercenary soldiers turned settlers turned distant manager from the sublime port of the capital city of Istanbul within the Ottoman Empire. The change will be to a group of people called the Janissaries. And Janissaries are essentially, like, I like to think of it as child soldiers. But one of the things that the Ottomans do very successfully is they conduct various missions where they head into Europe and they abduct various people who were previously of Eastern European origin. They take them back to Constantinople and they essentially begin the transformation of these abducted individuals, and they integrate them into Ottoman culture and, more importantly, into the Ottoman governmental machine. Now, that might sound vague, but here's what happened. Janissaries typically took one of three forms. Either a Janissary could, if they were smart, they would become like a contributing member, an official. I mean, in some cases we have examples of Janissaries who became members of the Diwan, just the smartest people that could then advise the Sultan. The strong Janissaries who showed a propensity or they seemed like they were skilled in fighting would be essentially incorporated into the Ottoman military. Again, displacing the Ghazis and making essentially both soldiers and government officials who had no loyalty to anyone. I mean, these were people sort of without a history or a past because they had been taken from their place of origin and now reintroduced and restarted within Ottoman society. The Sultan did this purposefully so that he could work with and have people at his disposal that did not have other allegiances. Now, this sounds familiar. It doesn't sound all that different from the efforts that the Tang emperors in China were trying to accomplish with their civil service exams. A way to have a pliable group of people that would serve at the hands of state. Now, the third way in which the Janissaries also took form were in members of the harem, so female members of the private quarters of the Sultan. Sometimes they were taken this way as well. In fact, the term for all three of these is the Devshirme, D-E-V-S-H-I-R-M-E. So the Janissaries were the soldiers who were taken by the Devshirme process. Other people taken by the Devshirme process would have been government officials in training and then female members of the harem. So the Devshirme gave rise to groups of people like the Janissaries and a few other categories. So, as I mentioned in class, I believe briefly, the Ottomans were tasked with being protectors of the Islamic faith because they were the most important or the most powerful Islamic dynasty. Suleiman did this quite well, and we know that he tried to keep all the pathways to Mecca available to all members of the global Islamic faith. And he also tried to be as tolerant culturally as possible by having Turkic be the language of the state, but also using Arabic as a language of religion and Persian as an language